Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to have you back with us. We have a lot to talk about today, and quite frankly, it is the single most important conversation we could be having right now regarding your financial future. We are standing at a precipice, looking out at a landscape that begs the question, is what we are seeing pure genius, or are we witnessing economic suicide in the year 2026? That is the question on everyone's mind as we analyze Donald Trump's so-called Madman Strategy. We need to understand exactly what happens to the U.S. economy when the rules are rewritten overnight, because the difference between a golden age and a total collapse might just be a matter of time. They tell us that inflation is under control at 3%. They tell us that the new tax cuts are putting more money directly into your pocket. But when we crunch the real numbers and look at the true cost of this strategy for American families, the picture is far more complex, and it explains why economists are quietly sounding the alarm about 2026. Do you remember April 2nd, 2025? That is a date that will likely be studied in economics textbooks for the next century. The administration called it Liberation Day. In the 48 hours that followed that announcement, $5 trillion in stock market value simply evaporated. The S&P 500 crashed 10%. It was the worst two-day plunge since the global pandemic. And unlike a virus, this crisis was entirely self-inflicted. I want to pause here for a second and ask you, where were you when the news broke that day? Did you panic and sell, or did you hold the line? Let me know in the comments below, because your reaction tells the real story of that day better than any chart can. But here's the thing. Right now, in January of 2026, the stock market has recovered. Unemployment is still sitting at 4%. Gas is under $3 a gallon. The administration is calling it the greatest economic success story in American history. However, having spent a decade analyzing economic crises, from the commodity crash of 2015 to the supply chain collapse a few years later, I can tell you today, with real numbers and hard data, what the consequences of this experiment will likely be. What we are witnessing isn't necessarily a stable economic policy, it is a sugar high. It is a rush of debt-fueled stimulus and deregulation that feels incredible right now, but it could lead us straight into either a sustained renaissance or a second Great Depression. Before we dive into the data, let me explain the central thesis of our discussion today. We call it the sugar coma economy. When you eat pure sugar, you get a rush, energy, and euphoria. Your blood glucose spikes, and you feel unstoppable. But if you do not balance it with real nutrition, you crash hard. That is exactly what is happening to the American economy right now. The sugar consists of tax cuts, deregulation, deficit spending, and easy money pressure on the Federal Reserve. The rush is what we see in stock market highs, low unemployment, cheap gas, and bigger tax refunds. But the crash that is coming involves inflation, trade war escalation, and a fiscal hole so deep it would take a generation to climb out of it. Now, it would be intellectually dishonest to say this economy is all bad. There are real benefits happening right now. But every one of those benefits comes with a price tag that is being deferred, not eliminated. Eventually, someone has to pay the bill. Let's start with the promise made on the campaign trail that inflation would vanish completely. Here is the reality. When the new administration took office in January 2025, inflation was at 3%. That was down from the 9.1% peak in 2022, but still above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. By December 2025, it is hovering around 2.7 to 3%. That sounds like success, right? Not so fast. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research organizations in the world, if the full agenda is implemented, inflation could surge to somewhere between 6 and 9% by late 2026. Let me repeat that. Up to 9% inflation, we are talking about a potential return to those painful levels we saw in 2022. So, what is fueling this potential surge? The first major catalyst we need to discuss is the tariff tax. Tariffs are taxes. Full stop. Despite what politicians claim, Americans pay them. Not China, not Europe, not Mexico. When the Liberation Day tariffs were announced, a 10% baseline tax was imposed on virtually all imports. For China, rates climbed as high as 145% on certain goods. The average United States tariff rate hit 17.7%, which is the highest since 1934. The Tax Foundation calculates this amounts to a $1,200 tax increase per American household in 2025, rising to $2,600 when fully implemented. That is not a theory, that is just math. I'm curious, are you seeing these price hikes in your local grocery store or at the gas pump yet? Or does it still feel stable where you live? Drop a comment with your state and what you're seeing on the shelves. I want to compare the data across the country. Beyond the tariffs, we are also facing a critical situation with the labor supply. The mass deportation campaign has removed hundreds of thousands of workers from industries that desperately need them, like agriculture, construction, and food processing. When you remove workers, labor costs rise. When labor costs rise, production costs rise. And when production costs rise, consumer prices rise. Economists call this a supply shock. It is essentially shooting yourself in the foot to prove you have a gun. Adding fuel to this fire is the unprecedented interference with the Federal Reserve. The administration has spent the past year publicly attacking the Federal Reserve chair, demanding rate cuts despite inflation remaining above target. There have been threats to fire officials and ideas floated about installing a more pliant chair. Here is what markets understand that politicians often do not. The moment a central bank loses its independence, its credibility collapses. And when credibility collapses, inflation expectations become unanchored. Every emerging market currency crisis in history started the same way, with a leader who thought he could bully the central bank into printing prosperity. On July 4th, 2025, because symbolism matters more than substance in this administration, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed. Let's look closer at what this bill actually entails, starting with the aspects that sound most appealing. First, it made the 2017 tax cuts permanent. No more expiration, lower rates forever. It also introduced new deductions, such as no federal tax on tips up to $25,000 a year, no tax on overtime pay up to $12,500, and no tax on Social Security benefits for most retirees. Additionally, it created tax-advantaged savings accounts for children with $5,000 annual contribution limits. On paper, this sounds great. More money in workers' pockets, more savings for kids. What is not to love? Well, the bitter reality is that none of this is paid for. The spending cuts from the new Department of Government Efficiency amounted to roughly $160 billion. That is a one-time savings. The tax cuts cost trillions every single year. Here is what the nonpartisan analysts say. The Tax Foundation, a center-right think tank, projects this agenda will add $3 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. The Penn-Wharton budget model, which leans neither left nor right, projects $7 trillion. To put that in perspective, $7 trillion is roughly the entire gross domestic product of Germany and France combined, added to our national credit card. And here is the cynical truth that both parties refuse to admit. Deficits at this scale will eventually force either massive spending cuts to programs like Social Security and Medicare, or massive tax increases on future generations. The bill always comes due. The only question is who pays it. Now, here is where things get interesting and where we need to think like geopolitical strategists rather than partisans. There's a concept in international relations called the Madman Theory. It was pioneered by Richard Nixon and his advisor Henry Kissinger during the Vietnam War. The idea is simple. If your enemies believe you're crazy enough to do anything, including irrational self-destruction, they will capitulate rather than risk provoking you. Nixon tried to convince the Soviets he might use nuclear weapons. He flew bombers loaded with nukes toward Soviet airspace for 18 hours straight just to send a message. This theory has now been adapted to economics. Consider what happened after the tariff announcements. South Korea's Samsung, facing potential 25% tariffs, announced a $37 billion investment in United States semiconductor manufacturing in Texas. Hyundai pledged $26 billion, including a new auto factory in Georgia and a steel plant in Louisiana. Toyota, despite absorbing $9.5 billion in tariff costs, announced plans to expand production and invest $21 billion in American facilities. Did the tariffs work? In a narrow sense, yes. The threat of economic chaos was used to force companies to build factories in America rather than risk exposure to unpredictable trade policy. But here's the problem with the Madman Theory. It only works until the bluff is called. Nixon's gambit failed because the Soviets did not believe he was actually insane. They called his bluff, and the war dragged on. We face the same risk today. When Liberation Day was announced, the stock market crashed. The administration panicked and announced a 90-day pause within a week. Then tariffs were reinstated. Then temporary truces were negotiated with China. Every reversal signals that the administration will back down if the pressure gets high enough. And once your opponents know you will blink, the leverage evaporates. A Harvard negotiation study put it bluntly: whatever is promised, whatever is threatened, people just are not going to believe it. And that makes it so much harder to leverage the power you have. The Madman Theory is a one-shot weapon. It has already been fired multiple times, and each time it revealed the gun might be loaded with blanks. This brings me to a question I really want your opinion on. Do you think this madman approach is a brilliant negotiation tactic that just needs more time, or is it a dangerous gamble that has already failed? There's no right answer, but I want to hear your perspective in the discussion below. Let's talk about what has actually happened since Liberation Day. The stock market crashed 10% in 2 days. The S&P 500 had its worst performance since the pandemic. The Nasdaq entered bear market territory. Trillions evaporated. Then markets recovered. By late June 2025, the S&P 500 hit new all-time highs. So, was it all a false alarm? No. Here is what the recovery obscures. China retaliated with 84 to 125% tariffs on American goods. United States agricultural exports to China collapsed. Soybean farmers, already struggling, watched their primary market evaporate overnight. Global supply chains built over decades do not just reroute in months. Companies are caught between absorbing tariff costs, passing them to consumers, or relocating manufacturing at enormous expense. The Peterson Institute forecasts that by 2026, trade policies will leave the United States gross domestic product 5% lower than it would otherwise be. 5% of GDP, that is over $1.3 trillion in lost economic output. And here is what tariff supporters do not want to acknowledge. The revenue does not match the projections. The Treasury Department projected tariffs would raise well over $500 billion, maybe $1 trillion. The reality was about $288 billion in 2025, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is far below expectations. Because tariffs also reduce trade volume. When things get more expensive, people buy less. It is almost like there's no such thing as a free lunch. Unemployment remains at roughly 4%, which is historically low. The administration points to this as proof the economy is working. But look beneath the headline number. Job creation has collapsed. In 2025, the economy added an average of 55,000 jobs per month. Compare that to 180,000 per month during the period from 2017 to 2019. Federal employment has been slashed by 270,000 workers. Real wages are up about 4% for the year, roughly $700 in extra purchasing power. But here is the catch. That growth is driven by labor shortages from immigration restrictions, which means the same dynamic is also driving inflation. You cannot have it both ways. Either wages rise because workers are scarce, which means prices rise too, or wages stagnate because workers are plentiful. There is no magic button that makes workers both scarce and cheap. Moody's Analytics forecasts that by 2027, the economy will have 2.6 million fewer jobs than it would under the status quo scenario. 2.6 million jobs. That is not a rounding error. That is a crisis. Now let's zoom out to the global chessboard because economics does not happen in a vacuum. If we look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, military aid has been frozen or slowed, pushing for a negotiated settlement that would effectively reward aggression with territorial gains. European allies are scrambling to fill the gap, but without American firepower, the position weakens daily. NATO trust is shattered. European nations are preparing for strategic autonomy, which is diplomatic code for saying they can no longer rely on America. Germany and France are accelerating independent defense capabilities. Shifting our focus to the Middle East, airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities were authorized. The two-state solution for Israel and Palestine has been officially abandoned. And then, of course, there's the situation with China. We see harsh tariffs combined with personal summits. It is confrontation and negotiation simultaneously, which creates maximum uncertainty for everyone involved. Here is what matters for economics. Unstable geopolitics means unstable markets. Every time a tweet goes out about tariffs or Iran or NATO, markets gyrate. Business investment freezes because executives cannot plan when policy changes hourly. The Peterson Institute found that tariff uncertainty alone has reduced business investment measurably. Companies are hoarding cash rather than building factories because they do not know what the rules will be next month. So, what does all this mean for you personally? Well, let's look at the immediate impact on your wallet. The good news is that gas is under $3 per gallon. That is real relief for commuters and truckers. Tax refunds are up, averaging about $1,000 more for many households. Mortgage rates have eased to 6.2%, still high historically, but down from the peaks that were over 7%. Stock portfolios have recovered, and then some for those with retirement accounts. However, we have to face the difficult reality on the other side. Imported goods cost more. This includes appliances, electronics, clothing, and furniture. Food prices are volatile as agricultural supply chains adjust. Social programs have been cut. SNAP benefits were temporarily suspended. Medicaid eligibility tightened. Health insurance costs are rising as subsidies erode. And uncertainty is everywhere. Nobody knows what the rules will be next quarter, next month, or even next week. So, is this a sugar high or sustainable growth? Let me leave you with this. The economy in January 2026 looks strong on the surface. Markets are up, unemployment is low, gas is cheap. But underneath, we are running on borrowed time and borrowed money. The national debt is exploding. Trade wars have destroyed relationships that took decades to build. Inflation pressures are building behind a dam of one-time corporate absorption and pre-tariff inventory depletion. By mid-2026, that dam may break. Retailers will have exhausted their stockpiles. Companies will have run out of margins to absorb costs. Consumers will face the full weight of tariffs that were always going to be passed through eventually. The sugar high is real. The crash may be too. I am not here to tell you which outcome is certain. Nobody can predict that with confidence. But I am here to tell you that this is the most dangerous economic experiment in American history. It is a wholesale rejection of the post-World War II consensus on trade alliances and fiscal responsibility. Whether it is genius or madness depends entirely on whether the world blinks first. And historically, the world has a pretty good poker face. I have studied every major trade war of the last century, and they all share one pattern. The country that starts it always believes they will win quickly. They never do. Let me make this personal for a moment. We talk to a lot of people in their 60s and 70s. People who spent 40 years building a retirement, who did everything right. Saved, invested, paid off the house, planned for Social Security, and now they are watching the news wondering if the rules are about to change. Here is what we tell them. You're not crazy to be worried, but you are also not helpless. The markets recovered after Liberation Day. Your retirement account probably looks fine right now, maybe even better than fine. But that recovery was built on two things. Hope that tariffs would be negotiated down, and companies absorbing costs they cannot absorb forever. By the middle of 2026, those buffers run out. Retailers will have sold through their pre-tariff inventory. Manufacturers will have exhausted their margins. And the price increases that have not hit yet, they are coming. Not because anyone wants them to, but because math does not care about politics. The question isn't whether there will be consequences. There will be. The question is whether those consequences will be manageable. A slowdown, some inflation, some adjustment, or whether they will compound into something worse. And that depends on decisions being made right now in Washington, in Beijing, in Brussels, and in boardrooms you will never see. What can you do? First, do not panic. Panic is never a strategy, but do not ignore the signals either. Second, diversify. If your entire retirement is in United States equities, you're betting everything on one outcome. That is not investing, that is gambling. Third, stay informed. Not from cable news shouting matches, but from actual data. The sources cited here, like the Peterson Institute, Penn Wharton, and Moody's Analytics, publish free reports. But before we wrap up today, I want to take this analysis one step further, beyond the charts and the data points, to something much more fundamental. We need to talk about the psychological and social reality of what living through a structural economic shift actually looks like. Many of you listening right now remember the late 1970s. You remember what it felt like when the price of goods seemed to change every time you went to the grocery store. You remember the feeling of your paycheck losing its potency between the first of the month and the 31st. That is the ghost that is haunting the 2026 economy. It is not just about the numbers, it is about the erosion of stability. When supply chains fracture and trade wars escalate, the first casualty is the just-in-time convenience we have all taken for granted for 30 years. We are moving from an era of abundance and immediacy to an era of friction and volatility. For those of you over 50, you have a unique advantage here. You have seen economic cycles before, you know that trees do not grow to the sky, and you know that bad times do not last forever. For those who lived through the stagflation of the Carter years, does the atmosphere today feel familiar to you? Does it remind you of the late 70s, or is this something completely new? Your experience matters, so please share your memories with the younger generation in the comments. But you also know that preparation is the antidote to anxiety. So, what does practical preparation look like in this specific environment? It means rethinking your relationship with liquidity. In a high inflation environment, holding too much cash is dangerous because it loses value every day. But in a volatile environment, holding no cash is suicide because you might need it when the markets are down. The key is balance. It means looking at your fixed costs. If you are carrying variable rate debt, like credit card balances or a home equity line of credit, that is the first fire you need to put out. As rates stay higher for longer to fight this new inflation, that debt becomes an anchor that will drag you down. We also need to talk about the great rotation in how we view value. For the last decade, wealth was about digital numbers on a screen. In a world of trade barriers and resource scarcity, wealth starts to look a lot more tangible. It looks like owning your home outright. It looks like having energy efficiency so you're not at the mercy of oil shocks. It looks like investing in your health, which is the only asset that cannot be taxed or inflated away. This isn't about becoming a survivalist. It is about becoming robust. It is about building a life that can withstand a shock to the system without collapsing. There's also a profound responsibility that falls on your generation. The younger generation, your children and grandchildren, have never seen inflation. They have never seen a true supply shock. They have only known the era of cheap goods and easy money. When the bill comes due, as it inevitably will, they're going to look to you for guidance. They will need your wisdom to understand that panic is not a solution, and that resilience is a learned skill. You are the emotional ballast for your families. That is a heavy burden, I know, but it is also a vital role. Furthermore, pay close attention to the shift from global to local. As international trade becomes weaponized, local economies become more important. Supporting local food systems and local businesses isn't just a charity anymore. It is a strategic defense against global disruptions. The shorter the supply chain between you and what you need, the safer you are. This is the time to strengthen those community ties, to know your neighbors, and to build networks that do not rely on a container ship arriving from across the ocean. Finally, do not let the noise consume you. The media cycle thrives on fear. They want you glued to the screen, terrified of the next tariff tweet or the next market dip. But you have the power to turn it off. Focus on what you can control: your household balance sheet, your health, your skills, and your relationships. The macroeconomy is a weather system. You cannot stop the storm, but you can certainly reinforce your shelter. This Madman Strategy is a gamble of historic proportions, and we are all chips on the table. But unlike a casino, you do not have to play by the house's rules. You can play your own game, a game of prudence, patience, and long-term perspective. Read the reports from the Peterson Institute and Penn Wharton, because the bill is coming. The only question is whether we pay it ourselves or leave it for our grandchildren. If you found this analysis valuable, keep following for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Drop a comment with your take. Is this sustainable growth or a sugar high? And do not forget to suggest the next topic for discussion.